Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Thank you for joining us today. Even though our mood is hardly celebratory today, given all the challenges that we are facing this year, July 1st marks an important day. We come to the end of an era in North America, one framed by the then visionary commercial agreement known as the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, an accord that lasted exactly 26 and a half years and gave an enormous impulse to the commercial integration and the economic integration in North America, our continent. And at the same time, we mark the beginning of a new accord, one negotiated over the last 2.5 years, which comes to substitute the old NAFTA. So today, we have called on a stellar panel of experts to speak to the legacy of NAFTA and the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which will enter into force exactly today. This panel of experts will give us, I am convinced, an important insight into what the new agreement contains, what it means, how it's going to be implemented, and what we can expect from it in the future. In a minute, the panel will be introduced by David Gantz. David Gantz is our Will Clayton Fellow on International Economics and Trade at the Baker Institute. So, without any further delay, to begin our panel today, let me pass the microphone on to David Gantz, who will direct this conversation, which then will open to you and your questions in the second half of the hour. Thank you very much. David?
Tony, thank you very much. Welcome to all of our panelists and to those of you who are listening in or will be listening later. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to celebrate with a number of the key officials or former officials who created NAFTA and also have created the USMCA. As Tony says, this is certainly something to celebrate on a day which otherwise might not be quite so pleasant for all of us. In addition, of course, to the COVID-19, it's also the 23rd anniversary of the turning over of Hong Kong from the British to China. We have three, and I hope a fourth distinguished panelist to talk to us today. And what it's been set up in such a way so that we have a couple of officials, former officials, who were key negotiators of the NAFTA 28 years ago, and also two of those who were key to making USMCA a reality. Charles Chip Rowe is a former assistant U.S. trade representative for North America. He was the deputy chief negotiator for NAFTA and has had a stellar career both in public service and in private practice. Colin Robertson was one of the key Canadian negotiators. He's with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute now. He was Deputy Minister of International Trade for the NAFTA Advisory Committee, and again, has been involved with NAFTA and now USMCA matters for something close to 30 years. Mr. C.J. Mahoney is the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative for Investment, Services, Labor, Environment, Africa, China, and the Western Hemisphere, which is quite a bit. I suspect that over the last couple of years, he spent a very high percentage of his time leading to working toward the successful conclusion of USMCA. Kenneth Smith Ramos from Mexico is now a trade consultant, but is a former chief negotiator for the modernization of NAFTA, which is the USMCA. So without any further ado, I will ask each of these gentlemen to speak for about 8 or 10 minutes, and then please feel free to submit your questions, and then we'll try to answer as many of those as possible. Chip, why don't you go forward?
Thank you, David. And thank you also to the Baker Institute for organizing this event. I think it's particularly appropriate that it comes from the Baker Institute because then Secretary of State Baker was one of the key figures in the forming of the NAFTA, as he was in the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement. David asked me to briefly discuss, by way of background, for what the main event, which is what's in this USMCA. What was the background on us starting the NAFTA, the first NAFTA negotiation, and what were the kinds of challenges that we faced in the construction of the original NAFTA? Perhaps for purposes of comparison. And in that regard, I think I'm going to discuss both of those things. But on the negotiating challenges, I thought it might be useful for me to talk a little bit about how we had three of what were one of the more important changes that were done in the USMCA, why they were done as they were in the original NAFTA. And in that regard, I'm talking about particularly the investor state dispute settlement mechanism of the investment chapter, the labor agreement, and also the rule of origin for automobiles. By the background of the NAFTA, David talks about it being 28 years old. For me, it's more than 30 years old. It all began when Mexico approached us, the United States, in early 1990, saying we would like to do a free trade agreement. At that time, we were, as a negotiating matter, we were in the middle of the Uruguay round, which was, or what became the Uruguay round. And that was somewhat bogged down, but there was a lot that had been done and a lot that was ongoing. The US and Canada had completed their free trade agreement, and it entered into force January 1st, 1989. One of my sins was I was the chief US lawyer on the US-Canada agreement. And Mexico was both, we saw as both a challenge, but a major opportunity as well. Mexico had been a very protectionist, very state interventionist economy, resistant to investment, a lot of state-owned enterprises. But Mexico was making some tremendous strides also. Tariffs that had been at 100% 10 years earlier had been taken down to bindings of 50% and applied rates of 20%. The government was starting to sell off some of the state enterprises and so forth. So it was encouraging that there had been improvement, and it was encouraging that Mexico was interested in doing a free trade agreement, presumably along the lines of what we had just done with Canada the year before. On the other hand, it was very worrisome to us too, because we were in the middle of negotiations of the Uruguay round. This was a particular concern to the USTR, which was known cheekily as we were among the agencies, the wet serape in on beginning negotiations, because we knew there was going to be a major challenge in trying to do what turned into the NAFTA at the same time as the Uruguay round. And we were also aware that while there were a lot of economic interests that saw the potential for growth with Mexico, there was also a fair degree of opposition, particularly from labor unions. This was also the beginning of the environmental movement discovering trade agreements, and their initial take on trade agreements was that they were polluters and bad for the environment and so forth. So we knew we had some opposition coming, and we did a lot of economic studies actually, and a lot of consulting along the way to see where there would be support, where there would be opposition. And that went on for really a year and a half before the negotiations were kicked off in June of 1991. The negotiating challenges, well, there were a few. We did have the Uruguay round had advanced in a lot of areas, and there was an intention to, in effect, to put into the NAFTA a lot of what we, the United States, wanted it to include much of what we wanted out of the Uruguay round. And we also had the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement as a background. And while there were things about it we wanted to do differently, there was also a lot about it that we liked. So, but we were going to be largely writing our own template, and on the kind of the labor and environment issues, it was going to be very new. There were really the negotiations. There were virtually every chapter had an element of controversy to it, simply because we didn't have we hadn't written the template at the time. Canada's participation initially was actually it was a thing. It was an issue whether Canada would participate. Canada initially had said to us when we asked them about it that they really didn't think they were wanting to join, and then they changed their mind, and there was a real worry in the U.S. government, never heavily voiced publicly, but a real worry in the U.S. government. Gosh, is Canada going to stall these negotiations? Are they really going to be, are they going to be a good participant and so forth? I mean, the fears, frankly, I looked back at my papers, and the fears were all pretty much all laughable in retrospect. But at the time, it was one of those things we worried about. Now, the negotiating issues, as I say, almost everything was a negotiating issue, but I wanted to touch on the three issues I mentioned just because they relate to what happened in the USMCA. First, the NAFTA included the NAFTA was unusual in that we wanted to include what was in effect the model bilateral investment treaty in the NAFTA. And we wanted to do it for a couple of reasons. There were a lot of US investors that had difficulty in Mexico. There was concern about Mexico's courts as a fair arbiter. And this was important to the business community. It was very uncontroversial in the United States. The notion that investor-state dispute settlement is an evil thing that is to be avoided was not there in 1992. So it actually wasn't a political problem for us. It was a political problem for Mexico, which had a long history of Calvo clause and so forth of being skeptical, but it was not really an issue for the United States. And interestingly, it was not an issue for Canada either, which had quite changed its view on foreign investment protections in the 4 years that had passed since the US-Canada negotiations. Now ISDS has been removed for Canada altogether, I guess after a 3-year period, and it doesn't apply to, it only applies to some sectors with respect to Mexico. My feeling as somebody who also argued cases is that much of we're not going to be, I don't think, totally happy with having gotten rid of the ISDS because, and we're going to find out why it was that it was put in, I'm sold that, and as is David, that we remember the bad old days of when there were no investment treaties and expropriation was a very difficult problem in international relations and so forth. Second thing, the labor agreement, which the labor and environment side agreements were something that came in with the Clinton administration. Governor Clinton had been a major supporter of free trade agreements and free trade, but he was under, as candidate for president, he was under a lot of pressure to, because of objections from labor unions and environmental groups. And the way he kind of took a compromise position in which he said during the campaign, after some delay, and in which he was reluctant to announce his position, but he came out in like a month or two before the elections, saying, I favor the NAFTA, but we need side agreements on to address what was seen as a problem of poor enforcement of Mexican labor laws and environmental laws. The mantra at that time was that the laws were very good, but that enforcement was poor, and we needed side agreements to address those problems. Those agreements, I think, were probably helpful to the Clinton administration in hanging on to Democratic votes. The negotiations were difficult because the business community of the United States was a little bit wary of these agreements, and the more the negotiations seemed to lean in favor of things that the business community thought would create problems for them, there was a certain risk of losing support from Republicans, and were we going to gain support from Democrats? But it came out where it came out. And no question that the labor agreement of that time was a weaker agreement than, it did have enforcement, but it was a weaker agreement, no question, than the successive iterations, and particularly especially the USMCA. But at the time, of course, it was the first time any trade agreement had tried to address labor rights at all. And then last, on the auto rule of origin, that was a big issue. There had been a 50% content requirement for the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement. For the United States was advocating I believe a 65% content requirement, and this was resisted by Canada was ready to increase but did not want to go so high. The critical issue with auto rules of origin, which I'm sure Ambassador Mahoney must have run into as well, is, you know, the content requirement is not a requirement that every car that is built in North America have X% North American content. It's that every car that is going to get duty-free treatment has to have that content requirement. And that means it gives you leverage, because you are for the privilege of not having to pay any duty. And that's an important privilege. Companies will do what is necessary to meet the content requirement. But especially with a US duty of 2.5%, there's a limit to how much uneconomic content you can force companies to adopt or introduce in order to qualify for the tariff preference. And that's true not just for, and this was important, it wasn't just what was then the US Big Three, Chrysler, Ford, and GM. There's major investment from Japanese and European companies. And, you know, is BMW going to make the car in North Carolina or assemble the car in North Carolina, or are they just going to ship it from Germany? So if you push the content requirement too high, you can have the counterproductive effect of leading to, yes, you get, in the case of the USMCA, 75% content in the cars, but is it so hard to meet that rule that as I say, instead of producing in North America, the production moves altogether back to Europe and just pay the duty? So that's to be seen. I mean, I think it would be great if the result of in the higher rule of origin of the USMCA, there is more production in North America. But the studies so far have suggested that this could actually turn out to being an unintended, but nevertheless a net negative. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm not sure whether I'm leaving it to Colin to give a Canadian perspective or to Ambassador Mahoney.
To Colin. Colin, please go ahead.
Oh, great. Hey, Colin.
Thanks. Well, thanks for that, Chip. You've given a sort of a comprehensive history. Certainly from a trade perspective, looking at this new, what we call it, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. It has, of course, 4 names: French English, Canadian English, and American English. When I was part of the team that negotiated the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement that Chip was the lawyer for, the Canadian chief negotiator who'd actually negotiated the first free trade agreement between Canada and the United States, the Auto Pact, back in 1965, he was our chief negotiator, and he said that he took from what doctors said, the whole approach is to do no harm. And I think that we can say that this new agreement does no harm. And certainly from a Canadian perspective, it is a good deal for Canada. First of all, it preserves our access to the United States. Like Mexico, Canada's biggest trading partner with 75% of our exports is the United States. That's particularly important for our small and medium-sized enterprises because the first market they enter is the United States, and then they can move on to other places. The other good news from a Canadian perspective in this is that we hope to see the exorcism of the NAFTA myth that unfortunately affected so much of trade in North America within the United States, because NAFTA became a dirty word in the United States. From a Canadian perspective, NAFTA was a good deal, but that wasn't the case in the US, and certainly our trading relationship over the past 20 years has been infected by the deep partisanship and also the strong feeling against the NAFTA in the United States. As we know, this New Deal would not have happened but for the Democrats in the House having made improvements. And frankly, from a Canadian perspective, things that we had not been able to get in our negotiations with the administration were put back in by the Democrats, that particularly related to things like labor and the environment. And so from our perspective, we got a kind of a second win out of this once it got to the House of Representatives and the changes that the administration had to make. From a Canadian perspective, our key has always been preserve dispute settlement for issues like countervail and anti-dump. That was there, something that matters to Canadians, and most foreigners don't get this, the cultural exemption for which we always pay, but their strong interest group and regional politics in Canada demanded that, which we put in. It did, as Chip said, it dumped the investor state provisions that initially we thought were put in the NAFTA at the request of American investors in Mexico, but it was used mostly against Canada. So we weren't unhappy to see that chapter disappear. There are other avenues, as Chip said, to pursue investor state, and particularly between Canada and the United States, because it was often Americans that were pursuing Canadian provinces. There are other avenues to pursue that. So we're happy to see that go. The labor and environment chapters that were side deals put in at the instigation of President Clinton and our new Prime Minister at that time, Jean Chrétien, are now, of course, full chapters. And that's important from a Canadian perspective because we think these are where modern trade agreements are going to go. Although some could argue, and I certainly felt that way for a long time, that the place for these things was both the ILO and, say, the Paris Agreement, that once you start treating trade agreements like a Christmas tree, when does it stop? But this is the price of what the modern trade agreements. So what we've got, though, is actually very good and taken from an agreement we'd like to see the U.S. eventually get into, and that's the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and some influence also from the Canada-Europe Trade Agreement, or CETA. There are new chapters on digital trade, transparency, corruption, as I mentioned, small and medium-sized enterprises. What's also important about this agreement is that while it has kind of review after 5 years with a time frame, it's kept evergreen with, I think there's some, when I count them up, 34 committees of stakeholders, everything from trade facilitation to competitiveness. And I think those are important because I think they will keep governments focused on the agreement. But that's where it's important to, again, the stakeholders, particularly the private sector, to take advantage of what's in this agreement to push things forward. From a Canadian perspective, our gives were all acceptable. There's more managed trade in autos. Chip's given the background as to why that's important, but there's a very high threshold from a Canadian perspective for future production before any of the threatened tariffs or would go into effect, the managed trade part. So we can certainly live with that. We've given up a little bit more quota to U.S. milk producers at the request of, again, Regional Politics Matter, Chuck Schumer in New York, and the New York milk producers in Wisconsin at the time, with then Speaker Paul Ryan. My own view is that we should, from a Canadian perspective, this was an opportunity for us to dump this and actually become competitive like New Zealand and Australia. But we didn't move that direction, although I think we'll probably see some more on milk, because Canadian milk producers can be very difficult, but happily we've got the Americans who will keep us honest on that one. So what's next? Well, I think the first thing absolutely vital for Canada and the US, of course, is reopening the border, but I don't see that happening now, probably till the late fall because of the resurgence, sadly, of COVID-19, particularly in the south of the United States. But it is important that we reopen the border, and I think because we've got a border that stretches the equivalent of Moscow to Beijing, that we could take a regional approach and perhaps open up parts of our border, because we do have such a long border, starting perhaps with the Yukon Alaska border. There are irritants. Already we read about them. I mentioned milk. Aluminum and steel tariffs are threatened once again, but I think that's as much to do with domestic politics in the United States as it is to do with the Canada-US relationship. The point is that we've now built this magnificent platform in North America, and we've just reaffirmed it and updated it. We should make it work for us and not play to particular special interests on either side, because I think, as David Petraeus and Robert Zellick pointed out in a paper they prepared for Harvard not too long ago, we have the opportunity with innovation in North America, where think of Silicon Valley, and we've got it all three countries, highly innovative. We've got the market, we've got the labor, and we have energy. So we really do have the opportunity, especially as reshoring is bound to take place, morphing out of the US-China trade war and COVID-19. There are opportunities now for North America. My own sense is that for the short term, no expectation of any future integration. We should be happy with what we've got, because certainly don't see Donald Trump as someone who favors integration, and in Mexico, we don't see that AMLO is particularly keen on further integration with North America. But the key thing is we've now got this agreement, and from a Canadian perspective, we spent much of the last 2 years building relationships beyond the administration. Traditionally, governments depend on administration to administration, but we've learned over the past 2 decades, but particularly in the negotiation of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, that we had to work both Congress and at the state and local level. And I know Mexico felt the same way, sending up cabinet secretaries, working regionally. We did the same thing. And those relationships, those personal relationships, I think are going to be vital going forward. And I think will allow us to, at least when you have an administration which is frankly America first and protectionist, to find countervailing forces in the United States, because that's how the US works, but to work with them. And I think we're now sophisticated enough to do that. I'll just maybe conclude that we've now got this North American platform. It's now up for us to realize it. I think, going forward, but probably not till after the next US election and perhaps a change in government in Mexico. But at least if there is a change in the United States coming November, I think you will see infrastructure renewal, something we need to attend to in North America. Tom Friedman points out quite famously that you have better infrastructure in China than in North America. And as I mentioned, the Harvard study says that's the one thing we have to fix: our grids, our ports, our bridges, rail and road. We've got an infrastructure bank, but it's quite nascent. We probably need to do more there. The Made in North America brand is a premium brand. I think that's one thing that we should be working on together. Digitization, we've got a chapter on digital trade, but one thing that's important right now, especially with the US-China dispute, is how do we deal with building the 5G platform? The administration wants us to keep out Huawei. I think we'll do that, but I think what we should be doing in North America, and again, Mexico's got advantages here. You think of Carlos Slim and the rest of it, we should be building the 5G equipment within North America. We should be providing the equipment to the rest of the world. I think we could do a North American model if we put our mind to it. People said use a defense production agreement in the United States. Why not do something like that, but do it on a North American basis? And then finally, I think going forward, and this applies to all three countries, but Mexico and Canada have agreements with Europe and with Asia, but like to see the United States eventually come into the Trans-Pacific Partnership and get an agreement with the Europeans. But I think that using the Canada-US-Mexico or the US-Mexico-Canada, TEDMAC as the model, there's still a lot more we can do. But for now, I think let's just give a cheer of relief. It is Canada Day. So we are delighted to see this agreement in place because it ends, in a sense, 3 years of uncertainty, which had an effect on investment in Canada. And now we feel we can go forward. There'll be bumps on the road, but we've now got a framework. And within the American Congress, there's bipartisan support. And that's very important for a country like Canada. I'll stop there. And I think I'm passing the baton on to Ambassador Mahoney.
All right, well, hello, everyone, and thanks to the Baker Institute. I'd also echo what Chip said. I think it's particularly appropriate that we're celebrating the entry into force through an event that is sponsored by the Baker Institute. Your namesake, Secretary Baker, certainly was important in helping to build this relationship, and I'm pleased to have been a part in these negotiations, which I think have built a stronger foundation for North American trade and for the relationship between all three of these countries. This is, I think, a historic day for North America, but it's also a bright spot in otherwise difficult times. USMCA certainly is not a cure for everything that ails us, but I think it is. It's notable that at a time when it's proven difficult to find consensus within our own domestic political system, as well as internationally, and particularly in the international trading system, USMCA stands out as a rare counterexample. I joined the administration in large part because I felt it was very important that we continue the free trade bloc in North America. North America really is, as many people have said, one of the world's best neighborhoods. All three countries bring something important to the table that enhances the competitiveness of the entire region. And you don't have to be a so-called globalist to acknowledge that the United States has a special stake in the success of Mexico and Canada as our neighbors and closest trading partners, which is all the more reason why we need to have a free trade agreement that unites these three countries. I don't know what the coming years or months will mean for the United States or for North America as a whole, but I am relatively confident that in 10 years, regardless of what kind of a tax system we have, regardless of what kind of a healthcare system or kind of global trading system, the USMCA will be there as the framework governing trade in North America. And I think it's an improved framework from NAFTA for many reasons, but perhaps the most important of which is the fact that this does have broad consensus in all three countries across all major parties in all three countries. NAFTA, by contrast, at least in the United States, narrowly passed the House of Representatives. It was a high-pitched battle that tainted not only perceptions of NAFTA, but made it more difficult to get other free trade agreements through the Congress. By contrast, USMCA attained the support of 385 members in the House and 90 in the Senate, from some of the most progressive to some of the most conservative members. I think hopefully for us, it is a template for a new bipartisan trade policy that we can build on and the years to come in negotiations with other countries. The negotiations that we had were difficult at times, but I hope as my friend Ken Smith will say when he speaks, they were straightforward and they were done in good faith. All three countries, all three negotiating teams worked very hard. We did so under an expedited time schedule, showed a great deal of creativity and flexibility, and I think most of us are pretty pleased with the result. I mean, the reality is that there was a lot of deferred maintenance on NAFTA, and that resulted in the need to do a negotiation where we did a major overhaul. My hope is that with USMCA, in particular because of the new review provision that we have, it will be possible to address issues and have the agreement adapt to changes in technology and changes in our economy on a periodic basis rather than wait for another major overhaul in 10 or 20 years' time. What I thought it was helpful, the 3 points that both Chip and Colin addressed on ISDS, labor, and auto rules of origin. I thought it might be helpful if I share my perspectives on those 3 issues, which, it will be a place where I will maybe voice a little bit of friendly disagreement with what the other panelists said. Now, with regard to ISDS, it's obviously a controversial issue, and it's one that has become controversial, particularly in the United States. The reality is that ISDS is challenged both by Democrats and Republicans for somewhat different reasons. I think as a political matter, it will be impossible. It would have been impossible in the United States to have passed this trade agreement or any trade agreement at this time without changing the ISDS model. I mean, the reality is that we don't have ISDS with a number of our top trading partners. We don't have ISDS in our free trade agreement that we have with Australia. What we did here, and really what I consider my own role to be, was to try to mediate so that we could find a solution that would protect investors, particularly Reliance interests that had built up in Mexico over the last 25 years, but at the same time calibrate ISDS in a way that would allow those protections to be there where they were most justified, but not have them where they were less justified. And I think in particular, the relationship between the United States and Canada. If you look at all of our free trade agreements where we have ISDS and where we don't, Canada in some ways was an anomaly. We have a very similar judicial system as the Canadians. Canada has an independent judicial system in the same way that we do. The case for an extrajudicial process to handle investment disputes between countries like the United States and Canada simply is just not all that compelling. Now, with regard to Mexico, in particular in sensitive areas like oil and gas and other sectors that formerly had been state-owned, I think it was a different situation. And so what we did was to work on a new model that, again, I think is calibrated to really where the investment risk in North America lies, rather than a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. I also think it's, everyone sort of forgets, everybody thinks of ISDS as being the only investment protection that we have in this agreement. We still have an investment chapter that applies to all 3 countries as an enforceable via the improved state-to-state dispute resolution system. So I think that that's an important thing to note. With regard to the two to labor, this is one of the crown jewels and one of the places where we have some of the most significant upgrades. With respect, I would disagree with my friend Colin's recitation of the negotiations that it was the Canadians who were pushing for improved labor standards, and it was only sort of at the end when the Democrats forced the administration and the Mexicans to come along. The reality is that it was both within the administration, but also on the Mexican side. There was great interest in seeing what we could do in this labor chapter to bring about more convergence in labor standards and to really eliminate a form of regulatory arbitrage that exists with the protection contracts in Mexico. Well before the midterm elections of 2018, we had negotiated the labor annex. Primarily, it was a negotiation between the United States and Mexico, and all of the underlying commitments that Mexico made were set forth in that annex. We, at the same time, actually did suggest, before the negotiations closed, something that was akin to the rapid response mechanism that we ultimately ended up adopting. Once the Democrats came in and took over control of the House of Representatives, the imperative to have that in order to secure passage of the agreement increased, that was a reason for Mexico to reconsider that issue. But it certainly wasn't something that was forced on the administration. We were for that from the beginning. It was just a question of getting that, of achieving that through the negotiations. With regard to the auto rules of origin, this, given that about 30% of the trade in North America is in autos, this was always going to be a significant issue. I'm always kind of amused when I hear people label what we did in the auto rules of origin as managed trade. Why the old rules of origin, which require 62.5% of a car's value to be in North America in order to have duty-free treatment, somehow is the beau ideal of free trade, but 75% and 40 to 45% labor value content somehow is managed trade, is something that I don't quite understand. The reality is that whenever you have rules of origin, you have some element of managed trade, but rules of origin are necessary in order to prevent free riding on the agreement. The reality is that particularly because of the way that because the NAFTA rules of origin had not been updated over the years, as time went by, the loopholes that allowed German and Asian car manufacturers to effectively free ride off of NAFTA had only gotten bigger and bigger. The parts list off of which the regional value content was calculated was frozen in time from the early 1990s, which meant that dashboard electronics, navigation systems, those sorts of things, if they came from outside of North America, they just were deemed to be originating content, irrespective of whether they were produced somewhere else. And these loopholes would have become much more important over time as new energy vehicles and autonomous vehicles come online. I also think another thing that's important to note is that we are at a point of, this is a turning point for the auto industry. All of the major auto companies right now are undergoing massive restructuring plans and implementing investment plans to decide how they are going to build and where they are going to build the next generation of automobiles. So having a new set of rules and a set of rules that incentivize the production of these cars in North America, I think was hugely important. Chip referred to studies which have said that the auto rules of origin will be a net negative. I'd like to get into that. I mean, the two studies that I've seen, I mean, one is the ITC study, which did suggest that there could be a slight decrease in auto sales in North America as a result of a marginal increase in prices. But that study also found that by only looking at two parts of the auto supply chains, engines and transmissions, that it would create between 25 and 30,000 jobs. We did our own study at USTR, which was based on proprietary information that was provided to us by the auto companies, and found that it will produce upwards of 80,000 jobs. And these are good, high-paying jobs, jobs that can support a middle-class lifestyle. So I think that's important. And when you sort of determine what is the net negative effect, if you're judging that based on the price of cars or the number of cars sold, you perhaps reach one conclusion. If you look at what does this mean for blue-collar people throughout North America, I would suggest that the improvements that we have made here, and again, I think that they're important improvements. But when you look at the baseline, I think that they're sensible improvements. They're also improvements that we worked through with the auto companies. I certainly take the point that was made is with a 2.5% MFN tariff on automobiles. I mean, that provides a governor on how aggressive you can be for auto rules of origin. If you make it more expensive to comply with the rules than the benefit that you obtain from duty-free treatment, that doesn't make a lot of sense. What we did was to work very, very closely with the companies. We also took into account the transition time that they needed. In a lot of instances, it's not the difficulty is not so much figuring out how to comply with the rules. It's figuring out it's aligning when you have to comply with the rules with when new models will come online. And with the transition rules that we worked out, we gave companies some leeway in dealing with these new rules over the next few years, but they will take compliance with the new rules into account as they have new investment and sourcing plans that come online over the next few years. So, overall, I think as a result of this overhaul of NAFTA, I think what we have is not only an agreement that is up to date, one that takes account of developments in the economy, But I think one that over time is going to prove to be more enduring. I think it will, because it was created in an environment in which it was politically popular in all three countries, with the legislators of all three countries. I think that today we start this relationship on a better foot than we did in 1994 when NAFTA started. And in all events, I think that as we look to the future, dealing with coronavirus and the need to create more resilient supply chains, this agreement will create a strong foundation that we can build on, and I'm excited to see how it develops in the years to come. So thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Okay, Ken, would you go forward, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Baker Institute for the opportunity to be with you today. Indeed, this is a historic moment, I believe, for the three North American nations. Without a doubt, the North American Free Trade Agreement brought great benefits for trade and investment in our region. And the goal of the NAFTA was all along phasing out tariffs and eliminating barriers at the border for facilitating trade between our countries. Now, the USMCA builds upon 26 years of successful free trade in our region, and it modernizes this key trade instrument for all three countries by introducing 12 chapters that have new disciplines that did not even exist when the original NAFTA was negotiated, but that are essential to today's world economy. In certain chapters, such as digital trade, the anti-corruption chapter that we introduced in order to strengthen international commitments to tackle a major issue that we have in Mexico. This was promoted actively by our private sector, and I think it's a very important cooperation chapter. Our chapter on how to help small and medium-sized enterprises take advantage of the trade agreements so that we have smaller, medium, and even micro enterprises be able to take advantage of Mexico's trade liberalization going forward. Chapters on state-owned enterprises, areas that had not been considered originally in the NAFTA are now part of the USMCA, and this will be essential for our future competitiveness. Also, some of the chapters that were already in the NAFTA had major upgrades. For example, in intellectual property, we just recently approved the package of legislation in Mexico that helps implement the new commitments in the USMCA. And one of the key elements is how we're strengthening intellectual property rights and having a sort of convergence in North America towards an environment that promotes innovation and technological development. And that is key for the future sectors, the sectors that will show the most growth in the future, in the areas such as pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, obviously everything related to copyright laws. So all of this is very important. There are elements that were upgraded through the USMCA and that we must definitely take into consideration as how it improves what we had vis-a-vis the NAFTA. Also, when we talk about customs procedures, the everyday activity of crossing the border, of actually making trade happen, we are facilitating, we're streamlining procedures. And this is something that is very important and may not appear in the front pages of the newspapers, but that is essential for all of the economic actors that every day have to cross the border and pursue international trade operations. So that's something that we upgraded, and it's very important. I agree with what CJ said in terms of this being a tough negotiation, but one that was done in good faith all along. We obtained a balanced result in the negotiation on automotive rules of origin. And both in autos and in other issues, we have to understand that where we were originally when we started the negotiation, I mean, we had in many areas diametrically opposed positions to what the US was putting on the table. And I think we both, and also Canada, were able to work towards solutions that help all three countries. At the end of the day, we're not imposing requirements in the auto sector that cause a disinvestment in the sector. That was our concern with the original positions. We are generating a situation in which we do make the rules of origin stricter, but we actually give our auto parts producers a chance to increase North American content in the automotive vehicles that are produced in all three countries. And that's very important for Mexico's auto parts sector. In addition to what is actually in the USMCA, which of course, as was said, we were able to maintain the legal certainty through the dispute settlement mechanisms, we have to understand that it's a very opportune moment to have the USMCA come into effect, because we are in the middle of perhaps the biggest economic crisis in the region in the last 100 years. The results of the COVID pandemic continue. We don't know when it's going to go away, but certainly to have such an anchor of free trade, which is represented through the USMCA, will help us deal with a lot of the problems that were caused by the COVID crisis. For example, the supply chain disruption. And what we saw in the crisis, in the health crisis, was the urgent need to have fluid channels of trade for key products such as personal protection equipment, medical equipment that has to do not only with the protection of health workers and the population, but also equipment such as ventilators and high-tech equipment that can cross the border quickly and reach to wherever it needs to reach in cases of emergency. Also, the issue that I was discussing in terms of promoting innovation and intellectual property is very important, because in the future, all countries will be working towards increasing their ability to have more investment in research and development to develop vaccines and some of the biological products that are essential as the new generation of medicines. So I think the table is set without a doubt for success in North America. But it is also true that it is truly up to us, the three North American countries, and that goes for the governments, the private sector, civil society in general, to really take advantage of it. I think it is very important to realize that trade liberalization has to go hand in hand with domestic public policies that create an environment that's conducive to attracting investment and that complies with many of the commitments that are in the USMCA. So Canada, Mexico, and the US must be aware of this. We have particular situations, I think, in Mexico that we have seen a total embracing by the AMLO administration of the USMCA. We negotiated in the previous administration shoulder to shoulder with them, with the transition team on the USMCA, and the AMLO administration was able, because of this, to obtain a major victory in our Senate, obtaining 107 votes in favor and only one against the agreement. So this is a very good example of, I believe, bipartisan agreement within Mexico. It's something that was transferred from one administration to the next, and we successfully, and they successfully in this government, brought it home. And so the key now is for public policy in Mexico to reflect what were the commitments established in the USMCA. And we have seen certain elements of regulatory backtracking, whether it's against renewable energies, in the electricity sector, in the ag sector, measures that are impeding the flow of cottonseed from the United States into Mexico, or potential regulation to roll back the possibility of creating a major ethanol national production program in Mexico. Things along those lines are worrisome, and countries must work to make sure that in Mexico, we don't have regulatory backtracking that could affect the implementation of the USMCA, but also in the United States. Without a doubt, there's an electoral year in the US. USMCA came into effect today, but there's going to be a lot of pressures on the administration from the part of the unions to act on labor cases. So Mexico should be ready to comply with all of the commitments that we agreed to do, and at the same time, make sure that there's no abuses in the system, for electoral reasons. And also from the perspective of the agricultural trade, there's quite a bit of pressure in the US from Florida and other delegations to kind of push the administration to install restrictions on the export of fresh fruits and vegetables from Mexico. And we hope that cooler heads will prevail in the US administration and that they will not go forward with these calls for seasonality measures. If we're able to get these irritants that we see right now off the table, I have no doubt that the USMCA will be a great instrument to create trade between our three nations and to attract investment. What we are seeing with the COVID crisis is a situation in which companies are now very much concerned with the impact that a sudden pandemic can have on their supply chains. Before, it was all about having global supply chains based on a cost-benefit analysis. Now there is the factor of risk, health risk that from one day to the next can shut down and paralyze your productive activities. So I think we're starting to see, and we will continue to see over the next few years, a trend towards reshoring, companies returning to North America. And I think that can benefit all three countries, especially Mexico, because we continue to be a very interesting center for attraction of foreign direct investment, a trampoline not only for the North American market, but also for the 46 countries with who we have free trade agreements. emissions. That's something that we must work together, Canada, Mexico, and the US, to realize that we are a bloc, that we are a production perimeter that can become stronger as long as we don't have trade irritants between ourselves and we concentrate on implementing the USMCA correctly so that we can compete successfully with the rest of the world. I will leave it at that and return it to you just by saying that this is a very important day for all three countries, and we are delighted to see finally that the USMCA has been born on July 1st. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken Smith-Ramos, and all of our other participants. I think we have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions, so I would like to start with those immediately. The first one is for Ambassador Mahoney, and I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Viewers have asked how the US government is and others are moving forward in terms of both the rapid response mechanism in the labor chapter and also the regulations, and particularly the appointment of panelists in the state-to-state dispute settlement chapter, chapter 31. So Ambassador Mahoney, can you enlighten me?
Yes. Actually, some news to report on the panelists. Those we actually issued a press release, I think, even within the last hour, announcing our agreement on panelists, both for Chapter 31 as well as for the rapid response. So that is done. We've also completed the negotiations over the rules of procedure for both state-to-state dispute settlement under Chapter 31 as well as for rapid response. We've completed the first round of uniform regulations, and then in the United States, the Department of Labor issued a Federal Register notice a couple of days ago on explaining their role in the labor value content calculation, and then Customs and Border Patrol, which started implementing the agreement at midnight, issued a new set of instructions for people who for those who are trading under the agreement in order to claim the preference. Now, with regard to the rapid response mechanism, I'm glad that was brought up. As Ambassador Lighthizer recently said, we intend to use the enforcement tools that we bargained for. But I think it's also important to note that all of these enforcement tools, including rapid response, are really designed so that what happens first is dialogue, an effort to try to work out problems. One of the things that we did in the rapid response mechanism is it's very express. There is notice to Mexico. There's an opportunity to discuss the problems, an opportunity for Mexico to cure any problems before you would actually go to a panel, which is really kind of the mechanism of last resort. I also think it's really important, and another positive feature of this mechanism is that it's designed to crack down on bad actors. If there's a problem in Mexico, it's not necessarily a problem with the entire Mexican government or with all employers in Mexico. If there's a problem with a particular facility, I think it makes sense that the costs be imposed on that facility and not be imposed on Mexico generally. So, overall, I think this is something that's going to lead to enhanced cooperation. I should also say that, in addition to the rapid response mechanism, another thing that happened in the late stages of the negotiations is that the United States Congress agreed to appropriate tens of millions of dollars in capacity building assistance and other types of assistance to support labor reforms in Mexico. So I think, obviously you can't have, if you don't have enforcement, you effectively don't have obligations. So it's important that we had a very effective enforcement mechanism. At the same time, my prediction is that there's going to be a lot more cooperation on these issues than conflict.
Thank you very much. Now, if I may ask a question to Kenneth Smith-Ramos, there's been some concern, I think, among many stakeholders that the 40% and 45% requirement for labor with $16 an hour or greater amounts in production of small cars and trucks would adversely affect the Mexican economy, although I guess there are other provisions that might go the other direction. Could you comment on that for us, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. I think this is one of the key elements of the new requirements for the rules of origin. Without out it's one of those results where we had a balanced negotiation result at the end of the day with the United States and with Canada, because the 40% labor value content is something that will enter in stages. Right now, as it enters today, it's at 30%, and it'll grow in 3 cuts to reach the 40% level. It is not something that is impossible to reach. It's something that when we worked with the OEMs in Mexico, we analyzed the conditions for them to gradually be able to reach these levels. At the beginning of the negotiation, the US had put on the table the possibility that salaries in the Mexican automotive sector be determined by the FTA, by the agreement, which Mexico deemed impossible. So one of the solutions that we found is to understand that even right now, or under the NAFTA, there was already a certain percentage of the vehicle that came from the US and Canada at a wage higher than $16 per hour. And that's something around, depending on the models, between 18 and 25%. So what we're now doing is we're introducing that concept into the rules of origin and having the gradual increase up to 40%. But that 40% can be divided between what is actually wages paid on the production line, but which goes to 25%. And then there's other elements that come into the calculation. So if an OEM has a facility that makes essential parts in the US, or has research and development facilities in the United States or Canada, that can be counted towards the labor value content. And for many of the OEMs in Mexico, that was the difference in between saying we cannot comply with that requirement, or we can comply. And at the end of the day, it was a balanced negotiation. And the way the labor value content calculation is broken down, it does not create a situation where companies, it becomes too expensive for them to produce and therefore to leave Mexico or to leave North America. So it is a positive result.
Thank you very much. I have a question now for Colin Robertson, and maybe Chip will want to add to it. Going back to the NAFTA negotiations of what is now Chapter 20, or was Chapter 20 until this morning, were there a lot of discussions over the issues of appointing panelists? You came away from a US-Canada free trade agreement where there had been 5 cases and they move along very well. So could you comment if you could comment somewhat on those negotiations and how you think they relate to what the new changes are in Article 30, in Chapter 31 of USMCA?
David, my sense was the appointment of panelists has not been an issue in Canada. There's sometimes been individuals, but it's I don't pretend to be the expert in this, but my sense is it worked out pretty well and has worked out in the past. So I'll let Chip speak to this, because I didn't think there was an issue here that was particular. Certainly wasn't one that in our preparations for this that was high on the agenda.
Chip? My recollection is that it was not a huge issue in fact, in the NAFTA negotiations. The main difference between the US-Canada dispute settlement mechanism and the NAFTA was we did this, I think, reverse selection process or some such as that. I think it's fine what they did in the USMCA. Personally, I'm altogether too familiar with the sugar dispute to think that the real problem in the sugar dispute, which is the one panel that wasn't able to be constituted, didn't have anything really to do with the selection process. But the United States, if it hadn't blocked there, it was probably going to block, not do anything at the end of the process, because it was such a highly political exercise. But that said, I was delighted to hear Ambassador, and I congratulate Ambassador Mahoney for getting his panel roster done right away. That really would have helped us. Unfortunately, when in the case of the NAFTA, shall we say, the civil servants came to a fairly rapid agreement on the roster that would be for the NAFTA, but it got clogged up in the political process for reasons really having nothing to do with protectionism and everything to do with diversity and that sort of thing. And by the time, and then unfortunately, we already had our first disputes. And it's very wise to get that roster done before you have disputes, because as soon as you have a dispute, you'll have constituents who will make it a headache for you to have a roster. We speak from experience.
Thank you, Chip. And now I'd like to move to Ambassador Mahoney again. There's a question that essentially, if I'm paraphrasing, but essentially says Mexico has been taking a number of measures that affect the renewable power industry. And the question is whether USTR or the US government is following this and is planning to do anything about it.
Well, we're definitely following these issues. There have been, there have been some issues with various aspects of regulation in the Mexican energy sector. And in some ways, it's interesting. I've been reading even some of the press coverage on the on entry into force today. The agreement does not eliminate all trade irritants between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The very fact that we have such a large and complex trading relationship means that we're going to have trade irritants. It's just a fact of life, and I don't think it necessarily bespeaks problems in a relationship. Again, I just think it's a natural. It's a natural effect when you have such a large and complex relationship. So listen, this is an issue we're going to have to work through. There are other issues. There are issues with approval of biotech products in Mexico. There will be issues with implementing the obligations that Canada has under dairy. But I think the important thing is that we have an agreement that provide structures that allow the countries to work through these issues in a way that is amicable and hopefully the least disruptive as possible.
Thank you very much. Now, going back to Kenneth Smith Ramos, one listener has pointed out that the agricultural provisions of NAFTA in some cases had adverse impact on small farmers in Mexico. And the question is there anything in USMCA that will be more favorable, say, to the smaller farmers?
Well, actually, I would respectfully disagree with the premise of the question. I think that if you look at what NAFTA has accomplished over 26 years and now the potential of the USMCA, is that Mexico has increased dramatically its exports of fruits and vegetables into the United States, and we're actually very complementary agricultural economies. The US exports to Mexico basically grains, oil seeds, and meat products, whereas Mexico is sending 50% of what we send to the US is fresh fruits and vegetables. We now have a $12 billion surplus in trade in the United States, and trade between Mexico and the US in ag is over $50 billion US dollars. We have seen the growth of many sectors in Mexico, including the meat sector, where we are now net exporters. We're exporting to places like Japan, Korea, of course, US and Canada. So we have seen great benefits. What you see, obviously, in rural Mexico is that we still find in agriculture in rural areas the largest pockets of poverty in Mexico, but that's the result of domestic policies over the last 70 or 80 years. So a combination of domestic policy plus trade liberalization in the way that is established in the USMCA will definitely help the rural population in Mexico. What does USMCA do? It maintains free trade in agricultural products with a very few exceptions, and it generates clear rules on sanitary and phytosanitary measures that guarantee the safety of the products that we trade between our countries, but at the same time ensure that there's transparency, that the decisions made in terms of regulations on sanitary and phytosanitary measures are based on science, and that they don't become additional obstacles or technical obstacles to trade. So I think the ag success story of the NAFTA should continue under USMCA as long as we implement all of these measures correctly.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn back to Chip first and then to Mr. Colin Robertson on investor state dispute settlement issues. Mostly, the question is, and Chip and I both share some heritage on this at the State Department in the early 70s, is the absence of dispute settlement mechanisms, third-party arbitration between Canada and Mexico likely to politicize future investment disputes, which are almost inevitable given the enormous investment relationship. And also, if Mr. Robertson can add on the point somebody made that essentially said with the TPP, you have more traditional ISDS, and does that make sense for Canada and the other parties? Chip, why don't you go ahead?
Listen, I understand what Ambassador Mahoney said about investor-state dispute settlement. I think that the investor-state dispute settlement became over time, and that's an interesting story by itself, it became the scapegoat for a lot. I think there's been a remarkable degree of misunderstanding of what the ISDS decisions have done. But the administration, it was almost a freebie to do it, because it's not that big a deal. I was really just raising the question whether we're going to be happy with it, whether there was something to getting the governments out of disputes. David, you and I will remember that it was in truth, the government was very reluctant to undertake dispute settlement, except in the most blatant cases, in the case of investment seizures. But the issue became impossible, and I think those who favor investor-state dispute settlement and investment protections really did an abysmal job defending themselves publicly, to the point that I think that any good Democrat has to hate ISDS no matter what anyway. So I don't know what solves that problem. I don't know what Colin's view is. On the Canada side, I would say that it was some of the cases were really pretty blatant. My recollection is that Newfoundland basically seized the Abitibi-Bowater mill for worth $200 million and said, and by the way, we're not going to compensate. That was not, a great moral thing.
David, this is Tony Payan. I think we may have room for a question or two more at most, and then we're running out of time. Thank you.
Everybody's asked to keep your video on if you're on the panel. So if this is the one more question, please let Colin Robertson respond to that last question that I asked Chip, if you wouldn't mind, briefly, please.
Sure, just briefly. I can't disagree with Chip's interpretation of Bowater. Fortunately, the federal government has sort of weighed in. Our provinces are sometimes like states and not necessarily good trading partners. But I think that, as was said earlier by perhaps CJ as well as Chip, between Canada and the United States, there's all sorts of vehicles to sort these things out. So the Bowater would have been sorted out, I think, anyways in other courts. Your question about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, important for Canada with developing economies. We have foreign investment protection agreements. That used to be what we did, but now with the both the CPTPP in particular, which also covers Mexico, Canada. So we still have an investor state, in a sense, coverage between Canada and Mexico through the CPTPP. I think that will work well. But between sophisticated economies like Canada and the United States, I think there's many other vehicles. So its removal is not going to handicap, I do not believe, American investors in investment in Canada, because there will be other means by which they can pursue it, which is probably the better way to do it.
Thank you. That, I guess this will happen, according to Tony, this will have to be my last question. So I'm going to ask it to Ambassador Mahoney. As you mentioned, the USMCA passed after modifications agreed to by USTR and the Democratic Congress, passed by enormous majorities in both houses. We also, many of us remember that the TPP was being roundly attacked in 2016 and 2017, not just by the Trump administration, but by many Democrats in Congress. And there are many who felt that it could never have gotten through Congress, at least in its existing form. Given that dichotomy, what does this mean for the future trade agreements that you're now negotiating, particularly with the UK, but also some countries in Africa and probably some others as well?
I think it's only a positive thing, because we now have a template that we can build from. agreement that obtained such overwhelming support. Now, all of these agreements will have their own complications. And in some ways, this was an easier agreement to do because we had a baseline. And, particularly from the perspective of a number of Democrats, the choice wasn't necessarily between, nothing and USMCA. The choice was between NAFTA and USMCA. And for those who had been among the most strident critics of NAFTA, having something that was an improvement, even if from their perspective it wasn't entirely perfect, made this an attractive proposition. In another situation where we don't have a free trade agreement, those debates might play out a little bit differently. But still, I think that we have a very strong base from which to build here. And I think that regardless of how things go, the very fact that we have this template will increase the chances of success. Both in our negotiations with the UK and with Kenya, and hopefully in further FTA negotiations to come.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mahoney, and all our other participants, Chip Rowe, Kenneth Smith-Ramos, and Colin Robertson. You've given us all, I think, a very interesting and individualized view of two enormously important negotiations, one 30 years ago, one very recently. Again, Ambassador Mahoney, I congratulate you on the entry into force of USMCA, and I'm very grateful to the Baker Institute as well. Chip?
Oh, I was just congratulating. I was endorsing by clapping your praise, Ambassador Mahoney.
Glad to hear it. We're very grateful to the Baker Institute, and I'm grateful to Chip for reminding us that James Baker was one of the players behind the initial desire to negotiate NAFTA in the first place. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.